and a middle and an end, or a conclusion to the sequence of events that flow through the story. And as they grow older, you teach them about conflict in the story, the addition of characters and tension between those characters, with rising action culminating in a denouement, the high point, in which the conflict and tension are resolved in the conclusion of the story. So stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now it may be a while since you last put pen to paper and wrote a story, but with our very lives, we are writing a story. Day in, day out, week by week, our lives write a story. And we live this story of our life. We live it in God, with God, and before God. I don't know how you think about your own life, how you feel about it. But a wonderful thing about living your life in relationship with God is that your story, your personal story, your unique story, is caught up in a much larger story, a capital S kind of story, the story of God's salvation work in the cosmos. The Germans have a wonderful word for this. It's called Heilgeschichte, which kind of sounds like a Nazi razor advertisement. Heilgeschichte, which is salvation history. A fundamental part of our worship in church is to gather and hear week by week this salvation history, this salvation story of God's inbreaking in human history. But we are to more than merely listen to this salvation story. We are called to hear in our hearts God's call to us to join in this story. The Spirit woos us, calls and invites us to respond to God's story, to find our own lives as part of that story. In worship, we offer our life story to God and find our own life story gathered up in God's story of salvation for this present age and the age to come. The psalmist has an acute awareness of salvation history. And as the psalm begins with two verses that we didn't speak together today, the author looks backwards for signs and tokens of God's salvation story to the people of Israel. The psalm begins, Lord, you were favorable to your land. You restored the fortunes of Jacob. You forgave the iniquity of your people. You pardoned all their sin. Our story, the story shared by both Jew and Christian, begins with the knowledge of God's mercy and forgiveness to a wayward and wandering people. You forgave. You pardoned all our sin. In this great act of mercy, God demonstrates God's favor to God's people. God is merciful and kind, ever working in us to restore us to spiritual health and fullness. Our story, the story of our own lives, begins in this love and favor. Before any of us were born, God sent his Son for us, the great pioneer of our faith, the great way maker who opens abundant life for all who would trust in him. In this Advent season, shall we place our hearts in his hands? As we place our hearts in God's hand, God weaves our own life story into the great salvation story, and we find life anew. Every story has a beginning. The beginning of the intentional journey of faith is found in the intersection of your life story and God's salvation story of love, mercy, and pardon. Now, usually, stories are told chronologically from beginning, middle, to end. In our second Peter reading, we fast forward to the great end of the story. The author writes of the end of the world, predicting the consummation of time and a great conflagration of fire, and the very elements of the earth will be dissolved. up in the presence of the Lord. Now, I don't know how the world will end, nor when. Robert Frost, my favorite American poet, wrote of the end. Some say the world will end in fire. Some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if I have to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. A little bit tongue-in-cheek there, I think, but pointing to the powers of desire and the powers of hate as well. During the years of the Cold War, certainly an era of fearful hate, the threat of nuclear holocaust hung over the heads of every human. Bible interpreters often saw the end of time in terms of nuclear disaster, as prophesied by Peter. Gratefully, that did not happen. And it causes us to wonder, though, today, if the heat of global warming foreshadows a fiery end to the earth. 2 Peter may be more pessimistic in outlook than the psalmist, who paints a more idyllic picture of the day of the Lord's return. To be fair, these scriptures handle different parts of the end-time story. 2 Peter talking of the end of history, while the psalmist writes of what it will be like to live in the presence of God. Verse 10 says, steadfast love and faithfulness will meet. Righteousness and peace will kiss each other. This is a scene of intimacy, of union of God's people with God. It is a scene of peace, harmony, fulfillment. Describing this further, the psalmist goes on. Faithfulness will spring up from the ground, and righteousness will look down from the sky. Heaven and earth will be joined, no longer a divide alienating one from the other. When will this be? Jesus Christ is the one who has come to earth in that great day of the Lord, and in him the divide between heaven and earth is mended. In him, human nature is wedded to the divine. In him, faithfulness springs up from the ground, and righteousness looks down from the sky. The Father declares to all who would hear, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." In Jesus Christ, the day of the Lord anticipated by the psalmist is fulfilled. Let us put our trust in him. Biblical spirituality often jumps to the end of the story to help give meaning and direction to the middle of the story, the part of the story in which we find our own lives, and through faith add our story to God's Heilige Geschichte. In last week's readings, we jumped to the end and heard the story of the return of the Son of Man, the second coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. Today, in the reading from Peter, we heard more about the end of history and the cataclysmic dissolution of the elements in a great fire. The end of this stage of history in preparation for the new heaven and the new earth. I believe the point of this is to build our faith that all time and the direction of history is in God's hands in some astounding, mystical way. From the beginning to end, from Alpha to Omega, from A to Z, the story is in God's hands. And it is in this security we invest the story of our own lives in the great salvation story of God. Alpha and Omega, beginning and end. Yet the story has a middle, a profound middle. For us, the middle of God's salvation story is where you and I and so many others presently live. The middle of God's salvation story is now. We are told at the end of the story that Christ will come again, so that we can frame up our lives and live our lives in the light of the end, with meaning and purpose. In light of the Lord's return, the author of 2 Peter asks the question of us this way: what sort of person ought you to be? While we wait for a new heavens and a new earth, where righteousness is truly at home, we ought to strive to be found in peace. Peace within ourselves, peace in our conscience, peace with our created world, peace with our God. The Lord speaks peace to God's people, to those who turn to him in their hearts, says the psalmist. God is actively at work in the world, building communities in which steadfast love and faithfulness will meet, communities in which righteousness and peace come together in harmonious living, such as in a kiss. Every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Our beginning is in God's mercy and healing love. The end of history and time as we know it is in God's hands too. The middle of the story, well, that's not all been written yet. You are writing it now, and Christ comes to help us and co-author each life story. May the author of our salvation so help write our stories that it may be said that righteousness and peace truly kissed among the people of St. Philip's.